Hi, I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum. So welcome here tonight. There are some people who are here for the first time or not. Yes, a few. Okay, welcome. I think that you're all friends of the topic of skyscrapers. It's good to have to be speaking to a crowd of sympathizers and empathizers for tall buildings. So we're really happy to be able to host this event that is organized by CTBUH, and I'll introduce Peyman Askari, who will be introducing the speakers in just a moment. And I'm going to remember to actually talk loud, which means that you guys all have to talk loud too, because since you're not amplified. So the reason that you are here tonight is this is the Skyscraper Museum, and I'm certainly very supportive of CTBUH, which is a great professional organization. We also had hoped that we could introduce you to this exhibition, and I hope you'll look around later, because we've done something quite different than is our normal MO. This exhibition, if you entered up the ramp, you saw the opening introduction, Tall Timber and the Future of Cities and Wood. And CTBUH has certainly been extremely active in the arena of advocating for mass timber, having done conferences and books, and it's in part because they co-curated this exhibition, which began in Chicago at the Chicago Architecture Center, that this show came here, although it was completely reborn in the topic of tall and urban, contrasting with the Chicago show. Because one of the things that we do in being apologists for the skyscraper and explainers of its history at the Skyscraper Museum, because most of what we do is really the history of the skyscraper, but we advocate for urban density, for tall and, well, say, mid-rise buildings in order to create a vital urban environment. And that is very much what the skyscraper is as an urban building type, and as a generator of vitality and density in a city, which is part of the very nature of commercial architecture, which is the description of the skyscraper, in my view. So, so this evening, and we're speaking to a sympathetic audience, I hope we're going to have to defend the skyscraper, which is now in the current political environment, I think, controversial, at least. And Jason will be addressing some of that, the resistance that he gets along the way in his advocacy for, oh, I'm not even holding up the book, which is over there. Okay. And now that part. So this evening is really to celebrate, oh, and Peyman's going to tell you this, Jason Barr's new book, Cities in the Sky, and also a book that was published last year on Billionaires Row by Katherine Clarke, who is the other speaker. So they in turn will present, and then there'll be a discussion. But the person who is going to moderate that discussion and also introduce the speakers is Peyman Askari, who is a founding partner of PAN, which is a consulting, global consulting management firm, management, real estate, investment, and development. So Peyman, I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you so much for hosting us and to collaborate this great event, with the CTBUH. So,
speak loudly.
Sure. Can you hear me? That's good. Okay. So today we are gathered we have two fantastic speakers. Jason Barr is a professor at the Rutgers University, professor of economics, and his focus being on urban and tall buildings, economic side of it. And also we have Katherine Clarke, who is the reporter from Wall Street Journal, and his focus being on real estate development and finance, especially in New York City. So a little bit about the CTBUH. So the Council of Tall Building and Urban Habitat, the CTBUH, is a nonprofit a global organization leading in tall buildings and also in dense urban, you are interested, getting involved with the organization. It's a great, place, all the profession in the industry, from architect, engineers, contractors, developer, economists. So everybody's, are involved who are interested in the tall building, where the urban density and also vertical growth of the future cities. And there are several activities and across the globe, CTBUH does, such events, and also the publications and some other research. And we have also here some of our board of trustees. Dennis Pune is here, and we have our chair, Ikai. And please, if you are not involved, I'm sure for the reason you are here tonight, so please get involved. We would love to have you, and to have, that interaction with the other profession, like-minded people you want to be involved. And every year there are conferences, international conferences in the different countries and cities, and we have also regional conferences in the United States, different states usually. So if you are interested to get involved, please, you can look at the website and find out more about it. So without further ado, so Jason, please, welcome you and Jason. Oh, first let's start with Jason. Sorry. Yes. Let's have your thoughts about your book, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, so thank you. First, I'd like to thank Carol for the invitation to talk about books and have this, what I hope will be an engaging and stimulating conversation about the role of tall buildings in cities. And thank you to Peyman, and thank you to CTBUH for sponsoring this evening. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about my book, and then Katherine will tell you about her book, and then we'll have our panel discussion and then some Q&A. So louder. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about the book, and hopefully I'll get you excited. And not only I hope that you will read it and buy it and read it, but share, spread the word. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about the book. The book is divided into 3 sections. The first part, I talk about the history of the tall building, and I talk about Chicago in 1880s, then move over to New York in the Roaring 20s, and then talk about post-World War II environment. And it's trying to give the background, because when we talk about skyscrapers in the 21st century, it's important to understand the long run history and how the tall building has kind of spread like a wave has spread like a wave out of the American cities across the rest of the world. If you think about the Empire State Building, if you look around the world, every city wants something that's their Empire State Building. So America has really launched this skyscraper, what might say the skyscraper revolution. And then in part 2 of the book, I move over and talk about the history of tall building in London. Originally, tall buildings were banned in 1894, but then in the 21st century, London embraced the tall building. Then I go over to Hong Kong and ask the question, how did Hong Kong become the densest city on planet Earth? And then over to the mainland China, which I'm sure most of you know, has built more tall buildings in the 21st century by far than any other country. And the real question is why? And then talk about Dubai and how Dubai came to embrace the tall building as a growth strategy for that city. Then, after talking about the history, I move over to what I call the good, bad, and the ugly. Fundamentally, tall buildings are very controversial, but the reason is that they survive and they thrive in the 21st century is because they provide benefits to urban residents. And so I go through that, sort of some of the underlying benefits that cities gain by having tall buildings. Then, you have to address the complaints. There's a lot of them, and I try to tackle them, but I guess I'm not going to convince everybody, but that's just the way it goes. And then the question is, what's going to happen in the future? And so I offer some thoughts. Now, I'm an economist, don't get scared, I promise, this looks scary, but it's not. So the first thing is, this is really the motivate, these two graphs motivate the book. Okay, so if you just look over here, over here, these are the heights of the tallest buildings completed in the early 19th century. They range in the 200-meter range. Then by the time you're in the 80s, you're up to 400 meters. Today, 500 meters are common. In other words, the trajectory of height over the 20th century and into the 21st century has been ever up. Okay, so what is driving tall buildings to get even taller? And this is just the number of 200-meter buildings. This is about 50 meters, 50 floors are tall. What is driving more and more tall buildings to be built around the world? You know, and it's just a question we should know. What is the underlying impulse for these buildings? And that's the motivator for the book. So what are the major themes of the book? Tall buildings serve an important purpose in our modern world. They shrink geography. They're basically creating vertical land. And cities, whether it's Lower Manhattan, Midtown, the City of London, Shanghai, Hong Kong, there's just more people who want to be at the same place at the same time. And how do you accommodate that demand? By going vertical. Now, again, don't be scared by this graph. It tells you one simple story. If you look at countries around the world and look at the size of their economies as measured by their gross domestic product and the number of tall buildings or the density of tall buildings, there's a very strong relationship. So fundamentally, around the world, we see that wherever there's an economic demand, wherever there's a demand for a large population, we see tall buildings. Okay, so the basic first theme is their existence is foremost driven by the demand and the forces of urbanization. The supply side is important, but I argue in the book it comes based on the needs of urbanization. So first you have the economic demand, and then the result, then the supply and the new technologies. So I talk about what I call the 3 skyscraper revolutions. The first is the invention of this tall building. Then after World War II, you have new innovations, the tube frame, for example, that gave rise to the Sears Tower, the Twin Towers. And then in our current climate, you have all kinds of structural designs and wind tunnel testing, a whole new suite of technologies that are making those heights possible, making it cheaper, less expensive to go tall. The other theme is what I call myth busting. People have a lot to say about tall buildings, okay? But as an economist, I will say, I hear the stories and I ask the question, is that really true? Is the stories and the ideas, are they true? What's the evidence? I've spent many years of my life looking at the data, the statistics, the underlying economic logic. I've done many hours of archival research. Okay, and many of the stories you hear about tall buildings, they simply just don't stand up to the evidence. So this is my last slide. Now I know among architectural historians that home insurance building has sort of been swept aside as this idea of the first skyscraper. But why is it still in the popular consciousness? I've looked at the letters, I've done the archival research. It all started in this public relations campaign by the Chicago School. It's really fascinating history. I don't have time, but it's all about sort of advocating for that. And it changed people's minds because of this public relations campaign. Record breakers, you always, even at tall building conferences, CTBUH conferences, ego. It's a much more complicated story, and people oversimplify by using this idea of the ego. Bedrock, I've talked a lot about how the bedrock in Manhattan did or did not influence the skyline. And then I talk about London and why it gave up skyscrapers early, even though it shouldn't have. I have a lot to say about that. And then I talk about public housing and residential high rises, and those things can work too. So that's the summary of the book. I'll turn it over to Kat. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am a lot less educated than Jason is about the skyscraper, and my book is a lot more gossipy than his. So I hope you're in the mood for some gossip. How does this work? I just press this?
now.
Okay. So I'm sure you're all aware, if you have been in Central Park recently, that to look aside from Central Park these days is to look upon a physical manifestation of tens of billions of dollars in global wealth. we've got all of these new super tall, super thin skyscrapers sort of bearing down on the southern end of the park and casting these long shadows. They've become known as the supertalls, and they were designed to be gilded, gated communities in the sky, and they were built with a single constituency in mind, the richest people on the planet. They have brought together celebrities, financiers, oligarchs, princes, offering views of the city from enormous heights and amenities like private clubs, private restaurants, pools, juice bars, basketball courts, golf simulators. They are homes, but they are also investment vehicles. Some of the owners have never set foot in their apartments, and they view them as one might a stock or an artwork from a great master, a vessel in which to store their wealth. My book starts around 2008 with Gary Barnett. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the big personalities of New York City real estate, but Gary Barnett is one of the biggest. His building, 157, which is the bluish tiled building right there in the center, was conceived before the global financial crisis of 2008, and it almost hit the skids as a result of it. He forged ahead despite the economic environment, and he broke ground at a time when all of his competitors were pressing pause. Everyone thought he was nuts. But he was rewarded for his perseverance. When sales at this building launched in 2011, it was one of the few luxury buildings that had debuted in Manhattan that year. And in its first full year of sales, 157 had about 50 signed deals totaling in excess of $1 billion. A lot of the buyers came from China, but they also had a couple of major US purchasers. A duplex in this building known as the Winter Garden, which is about midway up the tower, sold to the billionaire Bill Ackman for $91.5 million. And at the penthouse at the very top, sold to Michael Dell for $100.47 million. And that was the first deal in New York City history to break the $100 million mark. His fortune did not last with this building. When the high-end market began to soften in the late 2010s, 157 was the first to lose its luster amid competition from other high-end buildings along this corridor. There were also high-profile foreclosures in the building, and the design turned out to be pretty divisive. One of the building's most prominent critics, Donald Trump, tweeted, "157 is one of the worst looking buildings I've seen in a long time. It has an ugly skin." In recent years, the building's early buyers have ended up selling for significant losses. I'll give you an example. One of the units tied to a Chinese buyer sold for $31.9 million in 2021, and that was the seller had paid $47.5 in 2015. So while 157 helped establish Billionaires Row as a new investment vehicle for the super rich, that asset class turned out to be a lot less liquid than some buyers might have hoped. This might take me longer than 5 minutes. I'll try to go faster. Our next developer, I'm sure you all know, is Harry Macklowe. His building is 432 Park, which I'm sure you're all very aware of. If 157 was early to the party on Billionaires Row, 432 Park was very hot on its tail. Also conceived during the depths of the financial crisis, it was saved from foreclosure at the 11th hour when the LA private equity firm CIM took ownership from Harry Macklowe, but they still allowed him to be the face of the project. This is a slender geometric tower. It was so tall and so thin that they had to take great measures to protect it from the effects of the wind. Early sales benefited from the same rush that 157 benefited from. The penthouse here sold for $88 million to Fawaz Al Hokair, a Saudi retail magnate. In recent years, as I'm sure you're all aware, the building has been beset by allegations of construction defects. In 2021, the condo board here filed a $125 million lawsuit against the developers, alleging that the building was one of the worst examples of developer malfeasance in New York City history. It pointed to more than 1,500 alleged construction and design defects, horrible noise and vibrations, severe flooding and water damage, faulty elevators that trapped residents. Well, they said when they threw the trash in the chute, it sounded like a bomb. And the developers have denied. Our next building was developed by a guy named Steve Roth. He's really an office developer, but this was kind of his pet project, 220 Central Park South. This is considered the most prestigious and successful building on the corridor. And it was a long time in the making. It replaced a rent stabilized building, and there were lots of lawsuits with tenants there. Steve eschewed a more edgy, glassy, modern tower in favor of a classic limestone designed by Robert Amster Architects. It was a more conservative choice. It stood in dramatic contrast to what his competitors were doing, and it really brought in buyers. When sales started in 2015, it was without fanfare. They really didn't do much marketing at all. The units seemed to sell themselves. The strategy paid off. They logged more than $1.1 billion in commitments within 2 months of launching sales. They sold to Sting. Ken Griffin bought a penthouse there for $240 million, which set the record for the most expensive home ever sold in the United States. Even once the luxury market began to slide, it continued to log record deals. It was sort of the Teflon of buildings. Nothing seemed to stick. Financier Dan Ock sold his penthouse there for close to $190 million last year, which was roughly double what he paid 2 years prior. This is my second to last one. We're going to go very fast. Our ultimate developer is Michael Stern, and his building is 111 West 57th Street. It was the skinniest of the skyscrapers along the corridor and was described by the Atlantic magazine as the love child of a dustbuster and a Mach 3 razor.
I think it's just the next 2 blocks from this, that they are close.
Right. Sometimes called the Steinway building, it incorporates a roughly century-old showroom once occupied by Steinway Piano Company. This building was beset by problems from the outset. There were problems with the construction unions. The project wanted to go partially non-union, which was not a popular decision. There were disputes between the partners. There were construction delays. As of when my book came out, the project had sold less than half of its units. The project's original partners have also come under scrutiny from their lenders. And they've appointed a third-party development firm to consult on the construction following a crane accident here in 2020. This is my last building, Central Park Tower. It's the tallest primarily residential building in the world, and it represents Gary Barnett, our first developer's second bite at the Billionaires Row apple. Despite his success at 157, this project did not perform as well. It battled market headwinds for about 18 months when the pandemic hit. And by 2020, they had revised their expectations for profit, informing their shareholders that they would make 60% less than they had anticipated. And those projections have fallen even further. So while Barnett's initial success catapulted the market to new heights in 2012, his second building provided an apt bookend to the Billionaires Row boom, proving that the market for ultra high-end units wasn't as deep as some developers had hoped.
Well, so we're going to turn it to the just panel discussion with some questions from, and then we'll open it to you guys if you have questions. So the first question, Jason, is for you. So in your introduction, you mentioned that urbanization and tall buildings are 2 sides of the same coin. So could you elaborate on how urbanization has driven the demand for skyscraper over the past at least 2 decades?
Yeah, sure. So again, I approach this from the perspective of an economist. So I was looking at the numbers. In 1960, the population of the planet was 3 billion, and 1 out of 3 lived in cities. Today, the population is 8 billion, and nearly 5 billion live in cities. So how are you gonna accommodate all of these people? It's just, you can't do it in suburban, sprawled out housing. And quite frankly, many of the nations around the world are quite comfortable, quite happy living in high rises. I have a graduate student, and he was working in Shenzhen for Ping An, no less. And I said, "Where did you live?" He said, "Well, this opportunity came up for an apartment building on the 40th floor, and I put my name on the list, and I wanted to be there, and it had to be there." And so around the world, there's a very strong cultural preference to be in the center city, living in the cloud. And so at the end of the day, again, as long as there's rising incomes and people want to spend their incomes, going to restaurants, going to cultural venues. And also the internet too has made, ironically, the internet has made cities more important than anyone had ever thought. And part of that is just simply that work today is much more socialized, working in teams. Even though there's this whole work from home movement, it's still not going to drive the end of working in central cities. And so as long as there's all of these elements, income, population growth.
So the demand is the main factor.
Absolutely, absolutely. If a city wants to be vital and wants to grow, the question is, how can it best accommodate these people? And building up, it tends to be the correct answer. It's not the only answer, but statistically, if you look at it across the world, it tends to be the way cities succeed.
Okay, I think the technology has also another factor to it, but that's another question we'll ask.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, definitely demand is one of the major one for that urbanization. So my second question for you, Katherine. So based on the, especially if we look at the interest rate and the Fed and mortgage rate past 2 years been very tough, especially for the major big developers for doing, a new planning. So how have recent economic trends and interest rate changes impact real estate development for tall building in New York City, where your expertise mainly? And in your opinion, what strategies are developers employing to mitigate, financial risk in such a volatile, market? If you compare it also to 2008 and you see, and now with the interest rate, so what's your?
I think one of the big takeaways from my book for me was that it's really impossible for developers to mitigate financial risk when it comes to the economy, because these projects are very rarely started and completed in one economic cycle. They're conceived of years before there's ever a shovel in the ground, years before anyone ever thinks about a marketing strategy or launching sales. And so in order to make these buildings successful, you have to be comfortable with the fact that the economy could swing wildly in, different directions during the course of your project. So for the developers in my book that succeeded, it was the people who came in at a really low land cost basis. It was the people who had spent 20 years assembling a site at a low price and then built it at the right time. It was the folks who came in once they saw the success of those developers and thought, oh, there's money to be made here, and they paid the higher land prices that suffered as a result. But if you look at 157 or Central Park Tower, any of those projects, the economy shifted 2 or 3 times very significantly during the course of the project. So I don't think there is a way to mitigate it beyond keeping your costs as low as possible through it.
So there is no in terms of the financing cycle, they go and look at it and say, okay, we should start at the bottom of this cycle, then end up, some of the projects took longer, like a World Trade Center or others, were impacted with the 2 event of the economy.
Well, it's a catch-22, because if you're calling the bottom of the market, if you're developing, you're saying, oh, I think we're at the bottom of the market, this is the time for me to go and buy a really cheap piece of land. That's all well and good, but if you're at the property market, a lot of the banks are not willing to lend. And so, all the pieces don't come together.
Great one.
Actually, we'll offer two follow-ups.
Sure.
First, what I love about her book is how she talks about how the developers, so they need money, they go travel the world. You gotta be an equity partner, I need you, right? So Barnett seems to be notorious for traveling the world, getting equity
Yes.
when he can't get money from the banks. That's true, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
In 2008, when the economy was in the toilet, Barnett couldn't find the money to build his building, but he was sort of, he had this, strong feeling like if he built it, they would come once the market returned. And so he tried to prop up his prospects by adding more and more equity to the deal. And to do that, he had to go and, twist the arm of some Middle Eastern partners to give him some more money. So we see these developers sort of going to China and the Middle East and, all over the world trying to find the money to put enough equity in the deal so they can get a loan.
Can I add one more thing here about Billionaires Row? So when you look at the average asking prices over time, Billionaires Row, it's like up and down, but it's flat. You compare that with the broader New York City market and it's night and day. And so there's this kind of irony where we believe that Billionaires Row is kind of like this investment house, these places like stocks or bonds, but the return on investment is actually quite lousy. If you want to make a good investment, buy a house in Scarsdale and hold on to that for a while. Don't buy a Billionaires Row.
Yeah.
I don't think you can park quite as much money in a house in Scarsdale.
I don't know. But there's an irony to it that I don't think people quite.
I agree. I think if it goes back to 20 years ago, whoever bought a land in Manhattan, that's it. If you look at the other, investment in real estate in Manhattan, especially last 10 years, there's no justification really for investment to buy a real estate, but land, yes. Okay, so let's talk about the New York City zoning law. So, and their impact on skyscraper development. This is, both of you can jump, and give your opinion. How have these zoning regulations influenced the architectural style and functionality of the modern skyscrapers? If you look at for example, New York City, you compare it with other cities, so.
Well, from an architectural point of view, from a long run point of view, yeah, the rules of the game encourage, I know Carol has written a lot about this, the rules of the game encourage, they don't just like dictate, but they encourage various architectural styles. So the 1916 zoning code encouraged setbacks in these wedded cake styles. Then when they went to the floor area ratio in 1961, sort of encouraged these kind of glass towers. And it also, by capping floor area ratios, it introduced this whole idea of transferable development rights, air rights. And so that's become really a big sort of source of getting extra development rights to go taller and taller. So you're transferring unused rights to another property. And so all of these Billionaires Row, I don't know if all of them, but most of these Billionaires Row have been the beneficiaries of these transfers of these air rights. So that's also a part of zoning that, because basically the city has basically put a bubble over the real estate, a buildable real estate. So now, and so you could move around you could move around pockets as long as you're under the bubble as a city as a whole.
But if you look at for example, New York City in terms of the modern architecture. So I think one of the also important factor is the city encourage, different architects from across the globe, to come here and to present their work, which
Right.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
If you look at Dubai is exception, but other countries, they didn't really, they didn't really want other architect to come and do
Right.
but New York City was exception. They were like encouraged, don't you think?
Well, my take on this would be that New York City's recent sort of experimentation with like sort of more bolder or creative architecture is a result of technological improvements and the globalization of the skyscraper in general. I mean, traditionally, New York was never really known as like a cutting edge architectural environment.
Yeah.
So I think globalization has actually come back
Definitely.
to architecture in New York.
That's for past 2 decades, I'm
Yeah.
not going back before that, but past 2 decades.
I know.
What's your?
Yeah, okay. That's there's
I like what you said, like the rules of the game, because I feel like the zoning overhaul, I think it was in the 60s, please forgive me if that's wrong. Sort of for developers did kind of gamify the process of putting together a development site. You know, as far as Billionaires Row, for the most part, you know, those buildings are not in any kind of historic district. If you can put the parcels together and you can put the air rights together, you can essentially, you know, build what you want. And so to me, the most interesting part is that if you're a developer, your edge is your ability to cobble together these deals piecemeal. You know, with 157, I don't remember the exact number, but I think the putting together of that site involved about 25 different transactions. You know, it was going to the guy next door to sell his building, going to the guy next to him, you know, going to the private club down the street to ask them if they'll sell their air rights, you know, all they have to vote on it. So it was lobbying the members of that, lobbying the members of the church down the street for the, so it really does gamify the process. And to me, what was interesting was, you know, these buildings are super tall, but they're not super tall because there's all this demand to live in a super tall building per se. It was that, you know, these buildings are located on 57th Street, and for the most part, they're not actually on the park. So the reason to build so tall was because you can sell the apartments for so much more if you can see the park. So it's just about clearing the other buildings and then building as much as you can on top of that, so you can get the highest numbers.
So we going to the next question, which related to the first question we talked about. So louder, sure. We know the technological advancement, such as computer power, had a big influence in the skyscraper design and construction, especially last 2 decades. In your opinion, which had greater influence on the rapid growth of the tall building past 2 decades? Is it like a more, do you think, technological advancement, or do you think is more economic side of, you know, factors?
Okay, my take on this is that at the end of the day, what's driving the process are the landowners who are building tall buildings. They go to the architectural firms, the structural engineering firms, and they say, what have you got that could make this project work? And so I would say the evolution of technology really is coming from this global competition to get commissions. I mean, I know this sounds kind of, you know, probably maybe we'll get some flack from architects, I don't know, but to get commissions, there's you know, the market for these buildings is huge now, and so it's a very competitive environment, and this kind of competition, along with improvements in computing power, are allowing for you know, vast new array of new technologies. You know, and so with the Burj Khalifa, which was designed, you know, originally by SOM, I believe Adrian Smith, right?
Adrian.
He had a design idea for a building that used. Wait, no, wait. I'm getting my stories mixed up. The rather than try to figure out the stories, I'll just say a lot of these buildings are prototyped or sold early on as smaller, extra, you know, sort of different structural and engineering techniques are sold, and then when they could work, then they just expand it taller and taller. So I guess what I'm saying is there's this interaction between the developers and engineers and architects that's sort of driving the engineering.
Yeah, that's definitely, but as a structural engineer myself, I know that I think that technological advancement was one of the really major factors to build like a Burj Khalifa. That computer power helped a lot, and
pumping technology and so on. But for me, like the question is related to the, if we wanted, did you done any study to see the factors, which one driven more, the economic factors or this technological side last 2 decades? Because if the Burj Khalifa, that's a perfect example, mainly was economic,
Yeah.
driven with the, all the investment they've done around the Burj Khalifa. They made more money rather than the Burj. Burj lost money actually. So
I mean, I didn't quantify it in any way, whether it's demand first or supply first, but as I understand it, the EMAR did a call for proposals to different architecture firms, and I guess SOM
Yes.
pitched the buttress core idea. And that made perfect sense for a residential building, and make it super tall, super stiff, and reasonably economic to build. So, we want the world's tallest building, we want it primarily residential, what do you got? Okay, well, here's this buttress core idea, and so that's my sense, is it's sort of back and forth.
how about you, Catherine? Do you have you crossed any factors on this or not?
This is really Jason's department, but I'll say in New York, I think all of the tall buildings are driven by desire for profit more so than technological advancement.
Economic stuff. Okay. Good. So the next question. Audience in just 5 minutes. Yes, 5 minutes. The next question go to the more to you, Catherine, regarding the office buildings, the sector we know we're suffering right now, but not the new one. The new one, actually, they're doing very well, but the old one, they're suffering. And how do you see, where are the long-term implication of the office market trends?
We've written a lot about this at the Wall Street Journal. I haven't written about it personally, but I've been reading a lot from my colleagues. And it seems like we're going to reach an impasse at some point, because there are a lot of buildings, and Lower Manhattan is really sort of the poster child for this. There are a lot of older office buildings that are ripe for conversion to residential. They are older, they're vacant, they're not in great shape, they have smaller floor plates. And so they're perfect for residential conversion. The rental market here is very strong. So there's lots of demand for that type of project from developers. And they're pushing the envelope more and more. Like, they're doing this with buildings with deeper floor plates and buildings that are a little bit less conducive to residential use. They're sort of bending the line a little bit more. But at some point, I think we run out of buildings that are good for this. And then we have to confront our office demons.
Do you have any take on that? Please.
No, I agree. I agree with that. I think the city needs to move quicker or incentivize.
The regulation, I think that's something the city and our agencies needs to move faster and change some laws. Otherwise, we're gonna stuck, with old buildings.
Well, the last thing I'll say, we just have this notion in this city that a building is either office or it's residential with maybe a little bit of mixed use on the bottom. I think we can learn from the other countries in the world about how to make mixed use buildings truly mixed.
Yeah.
A little residential here, a little office here, maybe, retail, restaurants here, gyms, daycare, schools. If make a tall building truly a city in the sky. I don't think we should be afraid of that. I mean, this is the 21st century. We're not dealing with the same demons that caused zoning to be so hyper, what's the right word? Just to separate uses in such a concentrated way. So I think we need to rethink how we separate land uses or types of uses within a building.
The functionality.
Make it multifunctional.
Okay, the last question is gonna be the role of a skyscraper in the future cities, And looking forward, what role do you see skyscraper playing in the cities of tomorrow?
That's all you, Jason.
Again, as long as the demand.
Especially regarding the urban growth and.
Well, as long as urbanization is there, as long as, I'll just summarize it by saying, as long as people want to live in cities, as long as cities are labor markets and engines of economic progress, tall buildings will have a role. You know, I think people think that just because I talk about tall buildings, I'm like, it's like the tall building is.
No, I agree. It
Is
has a big
is a
role.
hammer that, you know, can solve all construction problems, but in my perspective, the tall building is just one element of the larger ecosystem. And as long as people want to be in central cities, there'll be a role for the tall building, and there will be a role for the mile-high building someday. It may be a bit of a Burj type situation to attract tourism or advertising. But I just, based on what I see,
It has a big role in sustainability. If we want to have a really sustainable cities.
Yeah.
You know, future smart sustainable cities,
right,
that's the way to go to reduce the emissions,
right.
decarbonizing, you know, all this. I
Yeah.
think the tall building is one of
So,
it.
so I just want to say, I've crunched the numbers. I've looked at suburban Queens with car use and single family homes, compared them to the Upper East Side, Upper West Side. Even where it's super rich, even that's the center, even with the super talls, on average, makes much more carbon sense than a sprawled out suburban driving
Yeah,
lifestyle.
I agree. The final thoughts to take away from your book. So what do you hope readers take away from your book about the importance and the future of the skyscraper and urban development? First, you.
I just hope they have a really good time reading it, and they find it really entertaining, and they get to know the personalities behind the skyscrapers.
And I believe you many times over succeeded in that. But yeah, I enjoy reading her book, so.
That's true.
Just history matters. The tall building is 140 years in the making. Myths abound because we tend to focus on this building and draw conclusions about all buildings. And architecture, engineering is all part of this larger story about our lives, our economic lives, our social lives. And so these are the kind of things I try to convey in my book.
Thank you. Now we open it to the floor. Anyone has a question, please raise your hand
And shout it out.
and shout out. Please, you first.
Yes, you mentioned that the Burj
Can
Khalifa.
you say your name?
Yes, I'm sorry, Cesar Esparza.
Okay.
You mentioned that the Burj Khalifa was profitable, but you mentioned otherwise, that it was not.
The board was not, but the whole development surrounding, you know, other building, which was MR was the developer. They made a lot of money from that.
But
Yeah,
the building
the
itself,
building, no, there was.
do you agree?
I'm not sure. You know, actually, I was listening to one of the lectures on Carol's lecture series with Adrian Smith. And he quoted a number, and I checked it out, and it seems pretty right. The observatory makes between 150 and $200 million alone. The sticker price of the Burj was $2-something billion. If you divide 200 million by 2 billion, you basically have a profitable observatory. They wanted to sell the franchise rights to the observatory, the Burj Khalifa, for $1 billion. Okay, so if you just sold that, you'd already pay for half the building. So even if only half the units sold, you're already at a profitable building. So, I mean, I haven't looked at all the apartments and stuff, but he's also definitely very much right. I crunched the numbers. If your apartment has a Burj view, 15% more on average premium. It's like the Central Park premium. Having a Burj when I was in Dubai, I looked out in my hotel room and I saw the Burj. I'm like, oh, cool, I got a Burj view. People pay a lot of money for that. So inside the building, I can't say 100% because I've never actually added up all of the sales that Emar did.
I mean, you don't have view to the Burj inside the Burj.
What?
You don't have views to the Burj.
That's true. If you're
Inside.
in the Burj, yeah, maybe you have some kind of extended mirror or something, but. So, yeah.
Oh, I'm Sunnyone, who is a board USA. So the question is, since US is the cradle of the high-rise skyscraper buildings, what holds the nation to build the highest building in the world? Is for the economy, for the regulation, or for the demand that you mentioned?
I think it's a combination, what Jason was earlier. Is a demand, of course, is the driven factor, but also it's the economic side of it, you know. It depends what, you know.
But it looks like, as Jason mentioned, the demand is endless. because of urbanization, globalization, whatever. And the economies make sense, build the high rise can make it profitable, even deserve for profit, this makes sense. Regulations can be changed. So what's the real reason to use the US to build the highest building in the world?
Okay, so first, I always put things in historical context. If you look at New York, even the Empire State Building was actually a profitable venture. It was really with the Twin Towers and then moving to Asia, where it became more about placemaking and increasing tourism, increasing land values. So the reason why the Burj works, the reason why the Petronas Towers works, the reason why these supertalls work today in the 21st century is partly about the internal economics, but also about those spillovers that make it, make sense. So, again, Emaar, which developed the Burj Khalifa, owned the 500 acres, which became known as downtown Dubai. Those spillovers to Emaar were enormously profitable. The observatory, enormously profitable. Just the brand recognition for that city alone is enormously profitable. So I think
one
that's
of
the
the
big motive.
desire-driven developers wants to. I
Yeah,
don't know if we answer your
I
question.
mean, because they are really expensive to build, but they're a lot cheaper in Asia than the US.
What it must mean is that can the skyscraper play the role of the city, like a sky city, or just a building?
I'd say halfway. If these things have, the problem is this, you can't really put more than 4 million square feet on the market in one building without kind of hurting the underlying economics. So that's why there's this impulse globally to make these towers skinnier, is just to reduce the total floor area. The Burj, I think, has 3 million square feet. The Jeddah Tower, if built, will have like 2.5 million square feet. These super talls are, again, I don't know how many, couple 100,000 square feet for
400, 600.
yeah. So the impulse actually is to make it skinnier and taller rather than a big global city within inside a building. That seems to be the trend.
Okay, you please.
Hi, Eugene Patron. I guess you could answer this from a historical or social perspective, but there seemed to be a period where, in popular association with notable tall buildings, they had a corporate name on them: Woolworths, Sears, and now more. But I mean, of course, Billionaires Row is a particular thing, but it seems like the captain's industry, instead of putting the corporate name on the building, now they want to live in it. Why do you think, it's kind of flipped, and companies, you don't have that kind of marquee thing happening as much?
Is that for me?
Yeah, both. I mean, yeah.
Well, okay, again, using the Burj as an example, that's a primarily residential. I mean, so the future of cities is commercial, is sort of like consumerism, is number one. Number two, if you look at New York City, I mean, it goes in these like 25-year cycles. It builds and then it saturates the market and it builds again. And so, Hudson Yards was a huge development, and that was sort of enough to kind of absorb much of the latent demand for tall buildings. So New York now is just kind of like adding a little bit here, a little bit there, because it's a developed economy, and it really doesn't need to build in the kind of the same way as it does. And maybe, yeah. So I hear what you're saying about the corporate headquarters, but
And when the shareholders, the idea of responding to shareholders like, yeah, we spent this money on a marquee, that doesn't go anymore like it maybe did in 1960.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. That's an excellent question. So I think, in Texas, when the
Carol
oil
can
boom
answer
happens.
I could answer it, but it'd be another evening.
Anyway, it's a great question. And, yeah.
See you later.
You please. You had a question, yeah.
My name is Jack Inchitor. I'm just amazed in Oklahoma City.
Oh.
that there was the catalyst throughout the United States, to have now a building that's gonna be 1,907 feet tall.
No, it's not.
In downtown Oklahoma City.
It's not gonna happen.
Okay, so let me add my economist 2 cents here.
New York developers respond not having the tallest building in the United States.
Well, okay, so, let me put my economist now. So when the Wall Street Journal reporter called me up, or CNN, one of these guys, I looked at the population of the city and their tallest building. And then I put the dot about where this tower would go. It's so far out from any like normal pattern about between the relationship between the size of a city and its tallest building. So the probability that it gets completed is close to 0.
Negative.
So there's that. And, you know, New York really, to be honest, I don't think New York really has the stomach to be like in that game in the way that Dubai is in that game, the way that China's in the game, the way Kuala Lumpur is in that game. New York's just kind of like, all right, we'll build tall, you know, we can make some money off of it, but they're not like, they gave up that game after 1974.
Manhattan
73.
is so, you know, it doesn't need it, it's so congested and it's so dense, they don't need to go super and
Right.
compete with the jet, the tower or other.
Right, but the
They don't
economics
need it.
don't
The
work
economy don't.
by
work, yeah.
themselves, so you gotta get the state, and after the Twin Towers, America basically said, we're not gonna have our governments supporting super tall record-breaking skyscrapers, so. Yeah, and all these other places, you get the backing of the government,
Yes.
so.
Do you know whether there's an FAA limitation on height in New York City?
Well, I don't know about New York City.
6,000 feet.
There is something in Chicago that limited the Sears Tower to 1,400 something feet. It limited the Ping An Tower, as I understand it, in Shenzhen.
In
but
Shenzhen, yeah,
I don't know about New York City.
I don't know either. I don't know.
I
My
think
sense
that's
is not,
6,000 feet,
but-
some, you know, someplace I read that.
Oh,
But,
there is a limitation?
and
Okay,
then, yeah, with the three airports, but I can't pin it down.
okay, Carol.
Alright, so I think one of the most interesting things that happened in the conversation between the two authors was the discussion of the volatility of prices of one project on Billionaires Row versus another, because we both looked at the results, right? So that poses the question, does design matter? We happen to have one of the architects of 220 Central Park South in the audience, and you know, frankly, the Ramsar projects have done extraordinarily well, and they look quite different than the glassy towers that are by a whole range of architects. So do you have any insights about what you think is a formula, and why, if let's say stone-faced towers are demonstrably more appealing, as they have been for more than 10 years from 15 Central Park South, why haven't more people gone in that direction, you know, having interviewed the architects and, you know, and maybe Jason just commenting on the market?
I've written so much about this and talked to so many real estate agents who've sold in all of these buildings that I feel like I have a good handle on it. So 220 Central Park South, like I said in the presentation, was like Teflon. Like no matter what happened in the market, people were still selling for huge numbers at 220 Central Park South. Meanwhile, all of their, you know, 220 is this very classical Ramsar design, limestone, sort of in the vein of 15 Central Park West, this kind of tried and tested formula, where all of the neighbors in these glassy buildings were suffering amid every economic headwind. And what I have sort of heard in the market is that it was two things. Credit on the design. People, you know, felt like their investment would be more protected in a building that was reminiscent of 15 CTBUH, which held its values pretty well. And on the other hand, it was really this very unique marketing strategy that they had at 220. You know, all of these other buildings came out of the gate and they were doing these splashy marketing campaigns and ads and stories everywhere, talking to media, talking to press, doing broker tours. You know, it was a free for all. But 220 had a strategy that I think would only have worked for them and only have worked for this developer, which was to be completely silent and say nothing. And so they never released renderings to the press. You know, at the Wall Street Journal, we wanted to write about the building. We would request renderings from Ramsar to write about it, and they would say no. And we would say, well, we're going to have to go on the sidewalk and take a picture of the building from the side of the street. It's not going to look as good. And they said, we don't care. And, you know, Steve Roth was so clever about sort of turning this building into what people have described as a private country club. He was paying attention to who was buying there and where their money was coming from, and it became this sort of word of mouth thing among very, very wealthy people. And once the name started to leak out from there, it just became this kind of domino effect. And so I think it was a combination of both the change in, or the difference in the design, but also just this very unique marketing strategy that might have been slightly unique to the moment as well, when the market was really on the upswing. And it, may not have worked in other cases, but Steve Roth had the Rolodex to pull it off.
And Jason, economics tends to abstract those principles, right? So how do you use economics in the face of this kind of anecdotal reporting and experience?
So here's, all I can say is very briefly is economics can be used with the new tools to investigate this question. I haven't personally done it, and so I think it's valuable to have reporting. But so I hate to say this, but I don't have a good answer to that question, other than it's something I've thought about as a potential research project, because of with AI and image ability to convert images to data. You can collect all kinds of buildings and look at how these measured designs correlate with things like sales or rents, or even you could even do word reviews or text analysis. So I think from an economist point of view, it's an area that deserves tremendous research using modern techniques. But I think for the time being, we need to rely on important reporting rather than what I've seen done in the research.
One more question, then we can have some wine here and some social, and then you can ask questions. Please, yes.
I really see all the upsetting. One question. So when you see super tall building design, there's always like an era in US, New York, right? And then you go to China and then Dubai. So it seems that the next trend will be Saudi, right? Where all the architects going there, building 2 km power or something. So what do you see? Is that a bubble, or what do you see?
Okay, so the only thing I can say quickly is it just seems like they're doing a top-down approach. If you look at the history of cities, New York emerged from the bottom up. The port and Wall Street. Dubai has a long history that people don't recognize, with the creek, dredging of the creek, and all of these, the airport. And so it was from that. So the question I have is, can you buy your way up with, can you lift yourself up with the bootstraps with tons and tons, with billions and billions of dollars? You have to have economic freedom. You have to have people have to be eager to come and stay and work. And I don't know that, that country is quite moved along that path in the way that Dubai did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I guess the short answer is I'm a little skeptical that they could succeed in this mission. So,
but they already shortened based on what they were planning to do. So they reduced a lot. So I don't know how they're going to move after 2 years.
So the last thing I'll say is it'd be wise for them to focus on a little bit more economic freedom, a little bit about, making people see Saudi Arabia as one nation among a large global network of nations. And if they can convince people that they're moving in that future-oriented direction, then you could build the tall buildings, then you could build the line. So I think you're going about it in reverse, but I don't know. That's just my view.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your opinion.